Honestly, it's just completely wild to me that this incredibly short-lived Broadway flop went on to become the hottest ticket in town that's making over $1 million a week and might end up winning the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Musical. Let's talk about why that is. Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is MickeyJo and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I'm a professional theatre critic from the UK, currently staying in New York, where I am seeing a bunch of Broadway, off-Broadway and American regional theatre. And in my first week in the city, I went to go and see Merrily We Roll Along. Let's be real, this was one of the main reasons why my fiancée Erin and I headed back to New York to come and see this show. It has just opened this weekend at the Hudson Theatre on Broadway after an off-Broadway run at New York Theatre Workshop, 10 years prior to which it was in London, first at the Minier Chocolate Factory, where I first saw the production before transferring to the West End's Harold Pinter Theatre. So I have seen this production before, but not with this incredibly exciting cast. It now stars Jonathan Groff, Daniel Radcliffe, and Lindsay Mendez. So if you're intrigued by those performers and know nothing else about this Stephen Sondheim musical, I'm going to give you a little bit of context today. I'm going to tell you why it's such a big deal that this show is now enjoying commercial and critical success. And of course, I'm going to be telling you what I thought of it. Is it worth the enormous ticket prices that it's charging? All will be covered in today's review. Now, if you enjoy this one, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming very soon about your favourite West End and Broadway shows. Also, if you have been to see Merrily We Roll Along, either on Broadway or in any of its recent incarnations, let us know in the comments section down below what you thought of it. For now though, let me tell you what I thought of Merrily We Roll Along on Broadway. So some context. Let me tell you how Merrily We Roll Along came to be. It was originally based on a Kaufman and Hart 1930s Broadway play about a playwright who was reflecting on his life, and the conceit of the thing is that we move backwards in time over about 20 years. It was about him and his other artist friends. I believe the original play featured a painter and a novelist, and the musical adaptation came about because of visionary director Hal Prince, who decided, because he wanted to work on a show about young people, about teenagers, that would be a good play to adapt and turn it into a musical. He then called up Stephen Sondheim, who was very excited about the idea, and from that came Merrily We Roll Along, a show about three friends, about Franklin Shepard, a Broadway composer turned film producer who we meet at the height of his Hollywood success, and his two friends, Mary Flynn, a novelist turned critic, and Charlie Kringus, a successful playwright. Now, at the beginning of the show, like I told you, Frank is enjoying huge Hollywood success, but he has a strained relationship with his wife. His friend Mary is by his side, but is a bitter alcoholic, and he is completely estranged from his friend Charlie Kringus, who gets name-dropped in that opening scene. What then happens is we move backwards in time, a few years at a time, through the 20 years of their friendship. And that, in and of itself, is a really interesting structure for a show, because you get this hugely enhanced sense of dramatic irony, which is where we as an audience know more than the characters on stage do about their own circumstances. We have glimpsed their future by the time that we travel back to their past, and we are seeing them getting increasingly earnest, increasingly hopeful, increasingly naive to certain situations and circumstances around them, certain other characters' motivations. We see young love that we know is going to crumble. We see blossoming friendships that we know won't last. We see the beginnings of careers that we know are ultimately going to change directions. And there's a fascination in that, as well as a profound heartbreak. The score is, I think, one of the most quintessentially Sondheim. The kind of style that he is often parodied for is most present in Merrily We Roll Along. This is a score that deals with the idea of memory, deals with different decades. We have a lot of recurring themes as we cycle backwards through these lives. Because two of our three central characters are a songwriting pair. We hear this one particular song that they've written go backwards through its stages of development. We hear the big splashy Broadway tune that it turned into. We hear the earnest original version they were trying to write, and then we hear the very beginnings of that where the melody is formed but it has a different lyrical idea, and the theme of that is also present in a lot of the other music in the show. It's a really clever score. It's also wordy and fiddly, and like I said, just typical Sondheim. There are so many glorious lyrics in there. My personal favourites are probably in the song Now You Know at the end of Act 1, where Mary is trying to reassure Frank that life goes on in the wake of a pretty brutal divorce. She sings to him, it's called Flowers Wilt, it's called Apples Rot, it's called Thieves Get Rich and Saints Get Shot, it's called God Don't Answer Prayers a Lot, okay, now you know. I think that's just brilliant, as is the song Franklin Shepherd Inc., a wonderful piece of musical theatre written by Stephen Sondheim, and just a gift to an actor. So much of this is. While we're talking about this material, some of my other favourite moments, when Frank is singing Growing Up, and then we have this little bit of a modulation into Gussie's version where she sings it alongside him, and he sings it in this very sort of hopeful and optimistic and pure key, and then there's this just slight insidiousness and this slight manipulation to the way that the music is characterized when she begins to sing it. It's all there in the orchestration. But then you also have these lovely moving ballads with a much sort of simpler focus. Something like Our Time just articulates this one very simple idea, but with beautiful lyrics and a soaring melody, the kind that Sondheim is often accused of not being able to write. He writes a lovely soaring ballad of melody when he wants to. Similarly, Not a Day Goes By, this heartbreaking torch song. And Good Thing Going, one of my absolute favourite Sondheim songs for its simplicity. Now, at the beginning of this video, I told you that this show had had kind of a remarkable journey, because originally when it was first produced, for various reasons that are worth exploring in a different video, it was not successful. This was a really significant flop, in fact. Both because of elements of the production and because of the material. That original version was largely considered not to be functional, and many revivals have been attempted in the years since. But this revival, when it was staged in 2013, I believe, at the Menier Chocolate Factory in London, which I saw, I believe was the first time that it got really a unanimously strong response, and people acknowledged, okay, this material can work. This version has put it together in such a way, has now sort of retooled it. There are different lyrics to the original, there are some different songs to the original, and this has been the most celebrated version of the show. A decade later, it's made it to Broadway. And in part because of this community's love of the works of Stephen Sondheim, who sadly has also recently passed, and in part because of the very starry casting at its centre, to quote a song from the show, it's a hit. But this video is not for me to tell you about other people's reviews, it's for me to tell you mine. So, what did I think of this specific production? So this has been directed by Maria Friedman, a legendary performer in her own right, who has more recently in her career turned to directing, and this is a really remarkable Broadway debut from her as a creative, because this is a truly brilliant production, the kind of brilliance that makes you question why this work was never thought to be functional in the first place, why people said that the show Merrily doesn't really work, because in this one, it so clearly does. There is nothing wrong with this material, there is nothing about this that isn't functional and gripping and fascinating. The characters are all so well developed, even the supporting characters in their orbit all have these really satisfying arcs. The briefest cameo of character gets referenced across multiple years so that we can see their trajectory. The pacing of this is so brilliant because we get to sit in each time period for long enough. We're not hurtling back through different moments at breakneck speed. We're not switching as quickly as something like The Last 5 Years or something like the play Constellations. We get to dwell in each moment so that we can really understand where exactly those characters are at that point in their lives, because they're all quite changed each time that we meet them, and it takes that time to gain the familiarity with them so that we can appreciate what has happened to them, to mould them and change them and damage them in the intervening period. The character of this particular revival is one that is very naturalistic, it's very true to life. We have this realistic set, it's not full of bells and whistles, it's about these portrayals, and it's about the performances, and it brings a sharp focus to those. So it does away with any sort of gimmicks that might get in the way of that. In the original production, incredible director Hal Prince wanted to have them cast as teenagers, as young adults, so that when we see them at their oldest at the beginning of the show, it felt like young people playing at being grown-ups who don't really know what they're doing. And I think there's a true metaphorical value in that, but it's hard to get past the layers of artifice that you're seeing. It doesn't make it feel particularly real when you know you're looking at something artificial. Whereas invert it, do it the other way around, with actors in their 30s, in their 40s, playing these damaged, wounded characters. By the end of the show, we see them sort of playing at a false optimism because we know that they are older than the young characters that they're portraying, and that serves to bring in a sort of a doomed, hopeless feeling at the end, which isn't super uplifting, but I do think it's more theatrically satisfying. And that's what the show is about. It's not about young people conceiving of what their futures might look like, it's about older people trying to remember their past and what brought them to this point and kind of reliving it as they are now. So that's what the show looks like, and that's why this one works. So in terms of stripping back the layers of theatricality, we do have a pretty bare set, which I'll talk more about momentarily. They don't have all that many costume changes. There are a few where it's necessary to the show. They all go to a party at one point, and the way that they're each dressed gives a bit of an indication about their characters. Frank is looking sort of the suavest out of the three. He wears a white button-up shirt and black trousers for most of the show, and when he goes to this party, it's all a sort of a black and white cocktail party themed, so he fits in naturally, which he does as a personality. Daniel Radcliffe as Charlie is completely incongruous to the mood of the party, but that doesn't seem to faze him. When we first see him, he's eating a bunch of food off of this serving plate while everyone else is drinking cocktails. And he's wearing this brown colour palette that doesn't go whatsoever with anything anyone else is wearing except for Lindsay Mendez, who turns up wearing this garish brown and orange dress that she had to borrow from the guy upstairs. It's a big comedy moment, but it also tells us a lot about her character. She doesn't fit in with those sort of fancy, snobbish New York socialites, neither does Charlie, but the two of them do go together. Someone who does visually transform completely over the course of the show is a character called Gussie Carnegie, whose significance I will tell you about further on, but she has probably one of the most significant arcs in terms of the development of her character, and even though she is a supporting character in the show, she is integral to the mechanics of the plot. She affects an awful lot of change within the central trio of characters, and were she not to be involved with the plot, they would probably all be a lot happier by the end of it. And they'd probably still be friends. She's the catalyst for the narrative in that sense. And she has wildly different costumes, wildly different wigs, as we see her crafting the person that she wants to be and building herself into who she's decided she's going to be, but in reverse. So circling back to the set, which I told you I would mention, I think there is value in having it in kind of this blank space. In the second act, we get more and more different set pieces. So we see Gussie, who is also a Broadway star, performing this big number in a show that Frank and Charlie have written. And we have this big sort of tassel curtain come down while she's doing that, and light bulbs. And that's a big wow moment. There's also a scene in which they are waiting by the stage door of that theatre, waiting to hear the audience's reaction on their opening night. And there's this huge billboard behind them, this huge poster about the show with what I will say is dreadful show artwork, but was also pretty representative of what artwork looked like in the 60s. It's a miracle that this show went on to be a hit with this weird poster of different coloured shoes that doesn't tell you anything about the show. But if you do look at some of those old Broadway posters, the artwork, even the artwork that's become iconic, does seem a little bit incompatible with the plot of the show itself and doesn't tell you much about that production. Listen, advertising was different in the 60s. Later in the show, but earlier in the plot, they also perform one of their own songs in a cabaret-style setup in a nightclub, and that has another tassel curtain and a piano that's brought on stage, and so we do get a lot more different locations in the second act of the show. It starts to feel more and more built up. In the first, we have this one set that just sort of slightly transforms. We have this clock on a wall that rotates and turns into a piece of artwork, but there's not all that much furniture. And this is because the focus is on the performances, the focus is on the text. I do wish there was a little bit more to this set. I wish that we got some of the sense of these different locations. They talk a lot about how stylish and sophisticated and wealthy Frank is and what good taste he has, but he doesn't have plants. Like, he just doesn't have much stuff. It's not unlike the production of Rebecca I saw recently in in London where he just has walls that don't have things on, and there could just be more furniture on this set. Because this show is now on Broadway, and though I will tell you how great this production is and how satisfying it is, it doesn't necessarily feel like a Broadway show. I get that it has to be because it's Daniel Radcliffe and Jonathan Groff and Lindsay Mendez, and I love that journey for Merrily We Roll Along. I love that it's made it back to Broadway and it's making literally over $1 million per week, but the scope of this production and its story and the size of its set makes it feel a lot better suited to an off-Broadway space. I feel like the audience experience would benefit from that level of intimacy. I'm sure it was amazing at New York Theatre Workshop. I saw it in a very small venue the first time I saw this production with a different cast. And in terms of trying to upscale it for New York and Broadway, they've added a second level to the set where the band are stationed in a sort of a room upstairs, and they've just widened the whole thing, but it doesn't fill that space. In a similar vein, there isn't all that much flash to the staging. I think the way that the principal characters are staged is very charming. The way they're choreographed in the song Old Friends, where though they're beginning to encounter some friction, we see that instant charm and bond between the three of them. The way that they're choreographed in that number is so wonderful, is so lovely. There's a moment where Lindsay Mendez interrupts an argument between the other two by pointing finger guns at them, and they're kind of like jumping towards each other and doing all these whimsical little things. I love everything about that. What I don't love as much is all the transitions between the different scenes, where you have the members of the ensemble cast walking out, taking their spots on stage, maybe they'll carry a box, staring profoundly into the audience, and singing lines from the titular song Merrily We Roll Along, many of which are a little bit nonsensical. Please don't revoke my Sondheim superfan card for saying this. Some of the lyrics in those transitions really do mean nothing. The number of times that we talk about the countryside, like, why are we talking about the countryside? None of this show takes place in the countryside. We're in Manhattan. Why are we singing about dashing through the countryside and see the pretty countryside? The number of times it gets referenced. What I think is some of the flattest and least rewarding material in the show is not upskilled or improved in this production with any kind of exciting staging. They just come out and sing it facing forwards. And what happens is we as an audience just wait for the leading characters to come back on stage and continue telling the story. It starts to make it feel like the ensemble wouldn't really be necessary if we didn't need them to play minor characters and crowds and so many different party scenes. The set and costume designer for this production was Sutra Gilmore, and that choreography was by Tim Jackson. But I've told you enough times in this video already that this show is really about its performances. If you're buying a ticket to this, that is what you are buying a ticket to go and see, is this central trio as well as the fabulous supporting characters around them. So let me tell you about these performances. Let's start with Jonathan Groff as Franklin Shepherd, because I think this is a very difficult role to get right, because of how dislikable he is when we first meet him. And it seems as though, as we are traversing this story but backwards, that he is making all of the wrong choices, and that everything that separates him from his friends and that alienates him from the good things that are happening in his life are all because of stuff that he's done and should be held accountable for. So it's difficult for us to warm to him as a protagonist, and you have to warm to the protagonist that you are tethered to throughout the story. And somehow he has enough charm that there is this flickering light of hope within him, even at the beginning of the show, even amidst so much going wrong and the hysteria that is this dreadful opening party sequence. We can still see flickering within him this regret and this remorse, and that begins to burn brighter and brighter as we go through the show until he's so beautifully, but by comparison heartbreakingly, optimistic by the end of the thing. He plays naivety so well, he is hugely endearing, and you can absolutely understand why all these other characters gravitate to him as a talent and as a personality. In particular, the scenes in the middle of the divorce proceedings, where he is faced with the reality that he might get separated from his son, and the scene that we'd seen before that takes place afterwards, where he's returning from this cruise and his friends are there to greet him, and Gussie is also there to greet him as well, and they've been having an affair, and the decision that he's going to make in that moment that will prove to be a pivotal one in shaping the rest of his life continues to evolve throughout the scene as he wrestles with all of the different directions he's being pulled in. Alongside him at the beginning of the show, we have Lindsay Mendez as Mary Flynn, who gives what I think is the standout phenomenal performance of this show. It's such a meaty role because we first encounter her as this bitter but witty alcoholic who is not enjoying this party that she's only at because of her friendship with Frank. She is a critic who used to be a successful novelist. She's making fun of the people and the culture around her that she resents, and she ends up making this big hysterical scene and having to leave. And then as we travel backwards through time, though she becomes a little bit more put together, she still has this enduring sarcastic wit that we recognize that is so funny, deeply charming. Not only that, but there is this gloriously human subtext because she harbors this very secret adoration for Franklin Shepard, Jonathan Groff's character. She is so madly in love with him that it lasts over decades, and just about everyone else around them, other than Frank, can tell that she is as well. The emotional high point of the show comes in the second act when we have what is technically a reprise of the song Not a Day Goes By, although it's the first time it's being performed chronologically, and it's sung by a character named Beth, who is getting married to Frank. In this moment, they're both very young, she's pregnant, but they have a tremendous amount of love for each other and they're very hopeful about their marriage. So she's singing Not a Day Goes By, in which I don't feel this profound love for you and I'm going to go on loving you day after day after day after day after day, except for the fact that in the first act, which took place in the future, you will remember, we've already heard her singing that song in the context of a divorce proceeding. And she's singing about how painfully she still loves him, but she has to leave him basically because of the extent to which he has hurt her. She's singing, I'll die day after day after day after day after day till the days go by. Now, all of that is genius enough. It's such a twist on the usual reprise format, where normally we get a lovely song that gets twisted and turned into a sad song in the second act. This does the reverse because we're moving backwards in time, so we sort of undo the pain of the first version by going back to the naive, optimistic first version. However, there's an added layer of pain that comes with that second act version, because while she is singing to Frank about how much she loves him and they're going to get married, Mary is singing the same melody, echoing and duetting it underneath at one side of the wedding because she is watching the man that she loves marry someone else. Lindsay's delivery of that is so fantastic. It's one of her strongest moments in the show, alongside her singing Now You Know, when she sort of steps out of this crowd who are all trying to uplift and reassure Frank when he's at his emotional low point. They've just been trying to build him up, and then she decides to deliver a little bit of tough love, and her delivery of that and the way that she is acting through song and really meaning all of these lyrics while also giving you this wonderful Lindsay Mendez incredibly unique jazzy vocal tone is just delicious. The brilliance of her is not only in the dryness of all of her one-liners, but it's how subtly she begins the very start of the show, and you almost will her to be a little bit broader, to be a little bit bigger, because some of those line readings, they're such delicious lines. One of the first things she says is, someone asks her, what do you do? And she says, I drink. And they say, no, what do you really do? And she says, I really drink. She plays it very small, very subtly. It still gets a big laugh, but she's such a real person in that moment, so that when she drinks more and more, when she becomes more hysterical, and when she makes a big scene, it feels earned, it feels grounded, and it feels real. What she plays through this show more so than anything else is truth. And then we have Daniel Radcliffe as Charlie Kringus, which is another fantastic role. In the first scene that we meet him in, it's when he and Frank are doing this TV interview together that ends up becoming a disaster. And he sings this song called Franklin Shepard Inc., in which he criticizes what Frank has gone on to become in stepping away from his work as a composer and getting more involved in producing and the financial sides of things. He thinks that he's sold out, and he levels this loaded, sarcastic accusation at him on live television as he is spiraling out of control, this man who never ought to be put in front of a TV camera. Daniel is this little ball of energy who so brilliantly whips himself up into a frenzy and explodes with this kind of electric energy. This is not an easy song to sing and to perform by any stretch of the imagination. I actually think it could start even smaller and it could end up even bigger. He does the whole thing quite confined to his seat, which again, it feels real. There's a part of me that longs for this to be a little bit more theatricalized and have him sort of terrorizing this TV studio and roaming and getting out of his chair and jumping up and down in hysterics. I think because in the context of the plot, this is such a fateful moment, it could be even bigger. But what's really lovely about his portrayal of Charlie is that similarly, he becomes more and more earnest. He still has this caustic wit, a lot like Mary, as we go through the show, but he also, again with the optimism, it begins to creep in steadily as we move backwards in time until we end up with him as this hugely endearing young man at the end who has nothing but love and support and admiration for his friend Frank and the wonderful music that he's been composing. That light and life in his eyes at the end of the show juxtaposes the resentment that we see him with at the beginning brilliantly. He also has a handful of very charming moments when he's performing Good Thing Going, just sweetly and realistically, not as a Broadway performer, but as a lyricist who has been asked to sing it at a party and isn't completely comfortable in that setting. When he is performing as 1/3 of the song Bobby and Jackie and Jack, he's so funny, he's so witty, he's so silly. He completes this magnificent trio of performances who critically all feel like best friends having a wonderful time on stage, which makes it all feel important. That's where we get these stakes from. It feels like a real tragedy if these three become estranged, which sadly from the beginning we know that they do. Then in the rest of the company, we have three real strong supporting characters. We have Katie Rose Clark, who plays Beth. In this production, she feels like a little bit of a smaller character because we focus so much on Gussie Carnegie, who I'm going to get to. Beth also feels characterized as someone who isn't necessarily the biggest talent as a performer when she first meets Frank and she's auditioning to be in their show, but the love that she has for him and this light that has died in her eyes is what is brought to the surface. She gives this devastating rendition of Not a Day Goes By as she's wrestling with the emotional weight of it all. At the end, she's not giving you this just pretty vocal, she is sobbing and hysterical and just devastated. We have Reg Rogers, who plays the producer Joe Josephson, who is also the ex-husband, current husband and future husband of Gussie Carnegie, in that order as we go through the show. We first meet him as a man down on his luck who is going to his ex-wife in secret for money to try and keep himself going. We then see him at the height of his success, and then for much of the rest of the show we see him being successful as this producer who alternately embraces and uplifts and celebrates Charlie and Frank as a songwriting pair, and then tells them that they need to make their work more commercial and sound less like Stravinsky, which is an anecdote from Sondheim based on an actual criticism of the score of West Side Story, if you can believe it. Reg is great as Joe. He has this really colourful characterisation of this character. He has this contrived sort of a vocal delivery, but he also feels like he doesn't shift quite as much, especially when we get into the second act. There is a pronounced difference between how he is when we first meet him and then when we see him again. But as we go back through those years, he doesn't feel like he gets as much younger as everyone else does around him, and it feels as though there could be a little bit more of a pronounced difference between some of his depictions in those different scenes. And then finally, we have Crystal Joy Brown as Gussie Carnegie. So I told you I'd tell you a little bit more about her character. We first meet her as this star with resentments. We see that she has been a great Broadway star, but she's been passed over for this film role because she is too old. She kind of embodies this sort of typical career of a great star. We see her when Hollywood is rejecting her out of its ageism and misogyny. We see her at the height of her Broadway success, and we see her when she is hustling as a young performer. We see her working other jobs, trying to break into the industry. And against that backdrop of her own personal frustrations, her machinations as the sort of the villain of this story are a lot more human. She is presented to us not as this sort of comic character as she often can be, but as a deeply real person. And though there are some deliciously sort of passive-aggressive, self-deprecating lines in this script that she doesn't necessarily hit with as much of a deliberately comedic rhythm, she feels more like a real person for that. What we do get is her vulnerability and her honesty and her pain. We glimpse something in her, Gussie Carnegie, that we don't often see, which is the reality of her as her own person and her worries and her loneliness. So we may not get quite as big of a laugh on the line, "I'm calling the Surgeon General tomorrow to have him cut out my tongue," but when she is confiding in Frank and pleading with him that he let her stay with him after she's left her husband, that scene feels a lot more painful. But those have been my thoughts about Merrily We Roll Along at the Hudson Theatre on Broadway. I hope that you enjoyed. I hope this let you know a little bit more about this production. And if you have been to see this already, I'm very intrigued to hear what you thought. So don't forget to tell us in the comments section down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you've enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews of all your favourite Broadway and West End shows coming very soon. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds.
I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!